À présent, je vais donner la parole à Farid Hafez. Farid, you are a PhD in political science, and you are the editor of the Yearbook on Islamophobia-Studies. You have been lecturing at different universities in many countries, and you are going to talk about the legal status of Muslims in Germany. So
Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to be here. And then the Bible says, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So I hope the biblical God will help me. Well, I'm going to talk about discipline, the Muslim subject, with Islamic theology. And it was very interesting to listen to, I forgot the name, of this neoconservative education, Islamophobia complex, the colleague Ahmed. And I'm not going to talk about neoliberalism, but I'm very much going to talk about the education issue and how education is used to discipline what he called it the Muslim being, I call it the Muslim subject, and how the state interferes, especially the internal security agencies interfere in trying to construe and to discipline, to rule what I call the Muslim subject. As an introduction, we have, when we talk about Germany, there are several aspects that I have to mention to understand the frame in which we are talking about. Germany's church-state relations is very much based on separation on one side, but on cooperation on the other side. Cooperation means what? It means the fields of, for instance, education or also social welfare. After the Second World War, churches have been legally recognized as public corporations and thus have a privileged status, which allows them, for instance, for religious classes in public schools. So, which is a status that the Muslim associations have not achieved yet. Nevertheless, and that's the important thing, is that the state has introduced different state constructions to deepen the process of institutionalization of Muslim religious practice and hence to bridge a legal recognition. One of those constructions is the so-called Islam Conference, which was introduced in 2006 by the Ministry of Interior. The aim was to discuss the future relation between Muslim religion and the German state, with so-called Muslim representatives. At the same time, what the literature says is that the Islam Conference has been experienced very much on the Muslim side as an asymmetric debate where security agencies are pushing their agenda at the back of the Muslim people. I just want to quote Lawrence, who says about religion policy in Europe that this very much allows European governments to gradually take ownership of their Muslim populations because it grants them unique influence over organizations and leadership they hardly achieve and aim at creating the institutional conditions for the emergence of an Italian or German Islam rather than just tolerating Islam in Italy or in Germany. This means that the state itself is interested in domesticating a former immigrant religion. In my analysis, I will try to analyze the politics of various German state agencies to work out how the Muslim subject is created and disciplined, and this very new phenomenon of centers of Islamic studies, which is in German language Islamische Theologie, will then be analyzed by interpreting official statements of the Council of Science and Humanities, the internal security agencies, and by interviewing institutional players in this process of institutionalization of Islamic theology. So, when I speak about securitization, I refer to the Copenhagen School, which says security is not an objective condition, but rather, depending on the securitizing actors in power, how objects are turned into security threats that require so-called extraordinary measures to be dealt with. A security narrative conditions the successful constitution of a threat. Security is regarded as being located in the realm of political argument and discursive legitimization. Thus, it is transformable, intersubjective, and socially construed. So security measures rely on the imagination of a security threat, and various scholars, such as Jocelyn Cesare, for instance, have described such a process and argue that it is, I quote, proposed that Islam is an existential threat to European political and secular norms and thereby justifies extraordinary measures against it, quote end. And here I link to what Levin Teschan, a political scientist of Germany, has used based on Foucault's reflections on subject and power, what he calls the Muslim subject, which was created by Islamizing Muslim immigrants and Islamizing debates on migration and integration. And this is what the anthropologist Werner Schiffauer called the so-called suspect subjects. What is for him the ultimate goal of the integration policy through the prevention of extremism and terrorism that could only be disciplined by influencing its attitudes, views, and convictions via the regulation of Muslim collectives. So in the context of Muslim religious life, the Muslim subject had to be disciplined and ruled for fear of being a threat, although the referent object of security in Islamophobic discourses is often quite diffuse, relying on empty words which we have heard throughout this conference, like values, etc. Security agencies throughout Europe started construing mosques and Muslim civic organizations as spaces of interference. Therefore, the incorporation of legal Muslim bodies into the political system seemed to be potentially helpful for security agencies to combat the threat of extremism and terrorism in the Muslim community. The German States Islam Conference, which made use of the mosque as a space to legitimize state interference into Muslim religious issues, to regulate and to rule it via the security dispositive, was not a strategy countering the security policy of the German internal security agencies, but rather it was the opposite. The dialogue was not a dialogue of equal participants at eye level, but an asymmetric Socratic dialogue that was very clear about the outcome of the dialogue before it had already started. So my argument here is that the political incorporation seems to have become a further tool for the German state, and especially its security agencies, to construe its ideal national Muslims, a politically obedient, loyal, and submissive Muslim subject. As various studies have shown, this new security policy with so-called preventive measures has led to a new and very close cooperation between the German internal security agencies, which is the Verfassungsschutz, immigration authorities on the other side, and the courts based on an imagination of a common threat, which is the Islamist terrorism. One of the significant consequences for our topic is that concerning Muslims, the usual checks and balances of various state authorities are very much reduced. And this increases very much the danger of false decisions and thus of injustice. And upon relying on the expertise of the internal security agencies by various state agencies, this very wide understanding of a security threat affects various fields of politics. And the one I will talk about is the field of education. To give you just one quote of how this definition of a security threat is widened in relation to so-called Islamist organizations. This is a quote discussing what the so-called legalist Islamist organization is. It says, I quote, "Legalist Islamist organizations follow a broader strategy of political influence. They present themselves as an interest group of great parts of Muslims living in Germany and strive for creating open spaces for their members to be able to implement a Sharia-based life. They offer a comprehensive network of education and ministry. This characteristic of legalist Islamism that looks at Muslims permanently living in Germany can support the creation of parallel Islamist societies, the so-called Parallelgesellschaft, and hence become a medium to long-term threat. This torpedoes state and societal integration efforts and facilitates a process of radicalization. And education aiming at opposing democratic institutions cannot be justified with the right to cultural difference. So what the internal state agencies in the end say is that those Islamist organizations that do position themselves in their declarations as pro-democracy, pro-constitution and this and that, use a double talk, and they should not be believed. And this affects very much the bigger and larger Muslim organizations such as the Islamic Community of Milli Görüş, which is one of the biggest institutions in Germany. So I will now switch to the Council of Science and Humanities, who gave a recommendation in 2010 to the expansion of Islamic studies, Islamic theology, and put special emphasis on the establishment of theologically competent advisory boards. The backdrop of this story is that due to this special regulation of third-stage relations in Germany, and due to what is said in the Constitution, that every religious group, a legally recognized denomination, has the right to self-determination of the religious community, they are allowed, for instance, to found departments of theology. The state is not allowed to do that alone, but he has to cooperate with the church or denomination. But on the other side, churches and denominations are very much allowed to create their own private higher education institutions. Therefore, the Council clearly states that also Muslims should have the right of participation in the appointment of professors, and the Council calls for the participation of Muslim umbrella organizations, theologically trained people from abroad, as the assumption says there are no in Germany, and prominent Muslims from public life, as there exists a majority of non-organized Muslims in Germany, also a creation of the German state. Although the Council is very much, and the people who were then participating were people like Nejla Kelek, etc. Although the Council is very much emphasizing the principle of parity of Article 140, there are very many critical dimensions. One aspect is the definitory power the Council gives itself. When it states, for instance, I quote, a church-like structure would be against the self-conception of Islam, quote end, which is a basic argument for allowing the Council to define who should be in the kind of constitutionally provided advisory board. And this is in fact, I would argue, a transgression of the range of discretion of the Council, as it reduces Islam to a certain understanding which is the state's understanding. And although this issue can be discussed very controversially, the reality of Muslim institutions knows a variety of church-like institutions in minority and majority contexts. A second aspect of involvement of a biased disposition is revealed in the passage where the Council argues that while Jewish and various Christian free church universities do have private institutions for higher learning, I quote, from the academic perspective for Muslims, this approach carries disadvantages for a discipline at this early stage, quote end. So it is argued and by an assumed lack of integration in academic cooperations with related disciplines within the university, and by saying that Islamic studies as a young discipline would not be able to recruit from a pool of homegrown young academics because that does not exist, the Council, I quote, recommends advancing the development of Islamic studies primarily within the state-run university system, quote end. So this again is first of all factually incorrect, because Islamic studies existed more than 1,400 years, but the idea behind this argument is to create a German Muslim subject that is defined by the German language and is construed in the context of an existing academic state system, and not independently and hence not autonomously. So in the end, also state universities would face the same problem of a lack of homegrown academics to recruit. And in fact, if you look at the professors who were granted professorships in those centers, we can see that nobody of them has any theological experience or training. So the council says, I quote again, considering the ethnic heterogeneity of the German Muslims, it would be utterly inconvenient to provide lectures or tutorials in Arabic or Turkish. It would also be obstructive to cooperation with other disciplines represented at the university in many cases, quote end. So by that another doubtful interference happens. While Islamic studies, from a scientific perspective, must be based on the Arabic language, as it's the case with Christian theology and Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek language, the council seems to deal with the language issue not that much from a social, very much from a social perspective, but not from a purely scientific one. And this again reveals the will of the council to determine the ideal Muslim subject that will be produced in these centers of knowledge production. So the politics of the advisory boards I will now talk about the politics of the advisory board that should have been established. First of all, only in 2 out of 4 centers of Islamic studies that were funded by the German state, in fact, advisory boards were established. And what can be observed here is not only various divergent ways of setting up the advisory board, but also the impact of the securitization on one side and the role Muslim theologians play on the other side that influence the constitution of these boards. I will try to discuss this non-establishment process in these four universities. In Münster, an 8-headed advisory board should have been established based on a contract between the university and Muslim umbrella organizations already back in 2011, what had not been done until now. And although the legal regulations do indicate an equal treatment of Muslims alongside regulations between the state and Christian churches, one nominated person's loyalty to the constitution was questioned by the internal state agency. So it was their interference in the process which stopped this process of the institutionalization. Another center in Tübingen, there had been an advisory board consisting of 7 theologians, while 5 of them were coming from local representatives of the largest Muslim civic associations. And originally the advisory board should have been established with a member linked to the Milli-Görüş movement. But, I mean, not a direct member, but indirectly to some extent. So, although they were included in the negotiations from the beginning on, according to the teaching staff of the university reckoned that by the exclusion of personnel from this community, this Islamic organization, the advisory board would not have to face any resistance from the government side, fearing not to be funded anymore. Which is in fact a lie, because the other institutions have established their centers of Islamic theology with no advisory boards at all. At the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, out of 13 members of the advisory board, 11 were independent and 2 were part of an Islamic institution. And here I quote the Minister of Interior of Bavaria, where he says about this institution, "It is a crucial goal for our integration policy that our fellow Muslim citizens can find a religious homeland, not outside of our society, but in the middle of it, as part of it. The bachelor study program is best suited in the hands of the University of Frankfurt with its long tradition of Islamic studies." So this statement is very revealing in many ways. It again shows the strategic placing of Islamic theology as a means of integration policy to form the Muslim subject, and it especially elucidates where the Ministry of Interior wants to see Islamic theology to develop namely inside the non-Muslim dominated university and not in study programs offered by Muslims for Muslims. So talking about religious homeland, not outside of our society but in the middle of it, indicates to the powerful determining how an appropriate Islamic theology has to look like, because the university obviously has a long history of Islamic studies, not mentioning that these Islamic study programs are mainly representing a non-Muslim perspective and are rooted in the Orientalist discipline. And another center, there is no advisory board at all. So while in the case, I'm concluding now, while in the case of Osnabrück, the center gives Muslim religious associations a possibility of participation in this process of creating Islamic theology at German universities, the other three centers of Islamic theology neglect the role of all organized Muslim associations. In Münster and Tübingen, the state interfered in the establishment of advisory boards by excluding different members of constitutional considerations. In Nuremberg, Erlangen, associations are a minority of the advisory board, while in Frankfurt no advisory board was established at all. So besides the structural interference of the internal security agencies, a substantial interference can be observed too. I give you one example to conclude with. While the head of the center in Münster has positioned himself on the margins of the many Muslim associations in Germany with his theology of mercy, many non-Muslims celebrate him as a liberal thinker. A statement of an assistant head of government department is very illustrative of the support he not only gets from the German mainstream media, but very much from the state bureaucracy itself. I quote, "The land of North Rhine-Westphalia won't accept the defamation of its professor. We stand by you. We want the success for this center of Islamic theology at the University of Münster." And this statement very much shows how much German state authorities interfere in the religious autonomy of Islamic theology, and German state authorities thus not only give some Muslims the microphone to speak while they silence the subaltern who is marked as a legalist Islamist, but rather the authorities take a step further and even interfere in defining suitable Islamic theology in contrast to not suitable one. So, state authorities with internal security agencies leading the way define which Muslims are allowed and which Muslims are not allowed to speak for, and hence define the future of Islamic theology. Indirectly, the ideal German Muslim subject is construed as fulfilling the goal of integration policy, being accepted by the non-Muslim German society, fitting it into its construction of normality, while ignoring objection coming from the subaltern Muslim. Thank you for your attention.